It's my pleasure to welcome Luke Jenkins this evening. Thank you very much to Luke for offering to deliver a talk for us on Hillforts. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. You can find the chat function across the top banner of your screen, and we'll field those to Luke at the end. If you've got any questions, again, please feel free to pop those in the chat for me, and I'll monitor that throughout. As we're coming up to 2 minutes past, we'll make a start. I'll hand over to Luke now. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's always a bit strange talking to a black screen, but I'm really glad to be here tonight to talk to you about Hillforts. My name is Luke Jenkins, and I am an archaeologist. I'm based in the southwest region of Heneb, which is why I'm talking about the southwest of Wales. I'm also our business development manager in my day job. But today's talk, wasn't that changed? Today's talk is based actually broadly on the comments of a friend of mine. I'm walking the coast path at the moment of Pembrokeshire, and my friend commented, "What are those bumpy bits on the hills?" The friend will remain unnamed for now. And it made me realise that some of the most distinct and remarkable archaeological remains we have in Wales, and indeed Britain, are not as obvious as we often think as archaeologists. And actually, what it is helpful to go over what these monuments are, why they're so important, and how interesting and diverse they are, so that hopefully when you see those bumpy bits on the hill, you have a bit of a better idea as to what they are. I will say, though, at this point, that this is going to be something of an idiot's guide, not a sort of a scholar's fantasy. So I hope you're along for the ride. We're also going to dart across West Wales quite a lot during the talk. So I hope you're all along for the ride. So starting at the beginning, we are talking about the Iron Age. These are Iron Age Hillforts principally. They start being built at the end of the Bronze Age, and with the main density in the Iron Age, but then they continue through into the Roman periods, particularly in West Wales, it must be said. Of course, many of you will know that these boundaries are not as fixed. Of course, it wasn't the Bronze Age at 701 BC, and then the Iron Age at 700. It is a building picture of cultural change. And actually the technological change that we use to demark change is actually only a small part of what we see in the archaeological record. Importantly, this is a prehistoric period, historic being when people start writing things down. So this is a period where we are working without the written word in majority, although there's a few exceptions there. So the questions we're asking are big. You know, how did people live? Where did they live? Who were those people? Rather than the sort of technicalities of day-to-day life. That makes it in some ways more interesting, but also much more difficult, of course. The Iron Age, to put it in perspective, the last period of prehistory, is a period of really quite profound cultural and social change. The Neolithic, several thousand years beforehand, marks the start of farming. People start chopping down trees and changing the landscape into a more human landscape. Through the Bronze Age, we see that becoming more comprehensive, and with new waves of immigration and movement of people, and changes in societies and belief systems. By the Iron Age, it is a complex swirl of different ideas and beliefs, and actually quite a densely used landscape, which is with trade being seen across the empire. And again, we will go into that much more extensively as we go on. In terms of the who, is it a Celtic peoples or a Celtic culture? 50 years ago, we would have lent much more towards them being a people, i.e. these are new people arriving in Britain. Certainly through the 60s and 70s, that was the sort of general idea, but now we lean much more towards it being actually sort of what we call acculturation, the diffusion of ideas and changing importance in society. These are the Celts, of course, which have taken on their own life within sort of modern culture. And is also somewhat entwined with Welshness, which is something that it is difficult to unpick at the moment. I've included here two pictures from a publication by George William, produced by Dyfed Archaeological Trust, our predecessor organisation in the 1980s. It's a really good public document based on two fantastic enclosures at Llawhaden in Pembrokeshire. We probably wouldn't call the booklet today "Fighting and Farming in Iron Age West Wales." And I certainly don't think we would include two sort of heads on spikes, with sort of someone grimacing around the edge as the main reconstruction. Rather, today, when we think about them, we think much more about ideas of household, the culture, the linguistic traditions, and that's not really a critique. It just shows how the priorities of today move on and changes our perception of things. Of course, those elements that I keep on mentioning are, many of you will be familiar with Celtic art, the swirly, what's often called Latin art, which is an art style that we see across Europe, is some of the most beautiful prehistoric items we get in Europe. And indeed, this is one of the best examples that we have from West Wales, Pembrokeshire chariot burial, which is excavated near Haverfordwest in the last 10 years or so. These are enamelled bridal wear from an incredibly elaborate burial, likely an incredibly important burial, which does show how complex the art designs were. And actually, that sort of swirly blue paint, which many of you will associate from going and getting dressed up as kids, was definitely the period we're talking about. And of course, this art has made its way into all sorts of different cultural things, including our own logo, no doubt. So this is an Iron Age logo in a very real way. The one link between Welshness and the Iron Age that really is true is so I'm sorry about the slightly bizarre lady. I was just Googling earlier and it came up. But Celtic language is something that is very much growing during this time and spreading up through Europe. And Celtic languages, which includes Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Breton, or the Brittany languages, and Cornish, they are a direct ancestor of Welsh, and that actually the Welsh that is spoken today is very much has its origins during this time. Of course, the missing picture in the Iron Age that I haven't mentioned so far, beyond the artwork and the people and the language, I couldn't find a picture for language, of course, beyond the scary lady, is the Hillforts, which are the monuments which most people would associate with the Iron Age. And beyond that, we have unenclosed settlement, but very little idea about the people themselves, because burials from this period, beyond the very weird and large ones, such as the chariot burials, are incredibly rare. When I spent quite a lot of time emphasizing that this is a prehistoric period, but of course, across the rest of Europe, we do have writing going on. And indeed, we do get snapshots of Britain and the Iron Age as we would see it in the writings of the time coming across from the continent. Of course, they're all sort of infused with their own influences and their own agendas. So we get these very weird sort of snippets of what was important to them, but also their opinions of what Iron Age people or Celtic people might have looked like. So we have a good, so this, Strabo here talks about how they're well supplied with milk but make no cheese. But they also say, you know, they use chariots for the most part, which is something we really can see in the archaeological record. We get a brief mention of the enclosures, which, as you know, dominate the archaeological record, but it's quite diminutive. You know, enclosures with trees, which have felled in, and in that enclosure make huts for themselves and also pen up their cattle. But it doesn't sound like the impressive monuments that we actually see. The other kind of sort of descriptions we get are often talking about the people, the red-haired, large limbs, inhabitants of Caledonia and that sort of thing. Their languages are not too similar, and you start to understand that these are people looking from the outside in, very much so, and not having a full understanding of the complexities of the societies that we're seeing. Just for fun, my favorite quote from Tacitus is, "The weather in Britain is foul with dense cloud and rain, but the cold is not severe," which I think we can all perhaps relate to or defend against, depending on your view of Westphalian weather. One very helpful document is Ptolemy's Geography, who does go and talk about the different tribes that we have in Wales. There are other descriptions of them, and Ptolemy doesn't get all of them, it's important to say, but he does quite well describe the Demetae, who do seem to be a cultural group who are living across southwest Wales. The one sort of question there is the northern part of southwest Wales, i.e. sort of Ceredigion as it is today. And I think we would all suspect that there is a name missing there, and maybe a different cultural group. So there, I think you're starting to get the picture. There's lots of questions. Who was in charge? Did they have religious leaders? Indeed, was anybody in charge? Who the heck are the Druids, which is a talk by itself. You know, Druids are of Celtic times and mentioned by the Romans, and we don't really understand, nor did the Romans understand what their role was in society. Was it a matriarchy, a patriarchy? Certainly there's some really good science going on about, you know, this being a matriarchy. Was war common? How hierarchical was society? Did slaves exist? These are big questions that we simply don't know the answer to. And I think perhaps the biggest question of all is, why on earth do people start building hill forts? It may seem like it's a given that people live in enclosures or defended enclosures when you look across history. But actually in the Bronze Age, the period beforehand, we don't have people living in defended settlements at all. They live in an open landscape. And then at the end of the Bronze Age, we suddenly start to get enclosures, which very quickly develop into some of the largest hill forts we see in Britain. We don't know why that is. What changed in society to make a hill fort necessary is a really, really huge question, and one that will probably puzzle us for a long, long time. Something changes. And clearly they were important enough to need building, but there's quite a lot of big questions left. So where are we talking about? I am going to talk about hill forts shortly. Don't you worry. We're talking about West Wales, i.e. Old Dyfed, and that isn't for any particular reason beyond the fact it's the bit that I know the most about. It's the bit that I've worked on, and it is also the territory of the former Dyfed Archaeological Trust, which is why it's the bit that I've worked on. Southwest Wales, though, is really pretty special in terms of its hill forts, and Wales is quite special for its hill forts as well. I think Wales would put in a good bid to say we have more hill forts than pretty much anywhere else in the world. They are slightly regionally distinct, I would say. They tend to be smaller, and as I said, more densely packed in, with distinct clusters which are detectable across Wales, and certainly regional groups, probably reflecting those broad cultural groups that we were discussing in Ptolemy's Geography. You will notice some sorry, I should preface that by saying some of these densities are the result of archaeological bias. So the northern end of the Severn is a really good example of this, where you have really good aerial photography surveys, which has shown up a lot of hill forts. Equally, there are great areas of absence, and one of the real densities is Southwest Wales, which I would argue has the, well, it does have the most in Wales. Again, sort of as a really good example of, you know, the kind of pattern we see across Wales, which is lots of densely clustered hill forts. In fact, there's an area in central Pembrokeshire around Letterston, which has almost certainly more density than anywhere else. So we're looking at about well, not exactly, 787 definite and possible enclosures as recorded by Murphy and Murphy in their enormous study of the hill forts of Southwest Wales. And you will start to notice that as archaeologists, we do put hill forts into boxes, but we'll go back to that in a little while. So what are those bumpy bits on a hill? Well, this is the dictionary definition, a general term used to describe a fortification on the hilltop, the best known of which are later prehistoric examples, mainly of later Bronze Age and Iron Age date, the first millennium BC. Now, anyone here who's an archaeologist will know that archaeological definitions are usually rubbish, and that's because they're often trying to bring together things that are often not that similar. And that's certainly the case with hill forts, and to include two examples here. One is Maiden Castle, the largest hill fort, certainly in the southern part of the country. It's certainly amongst the largest in the UK, full stop. It's about 20 hectares, 19-20 hectares by memory, 7-meter deep ditches, 3 layers thick. You know, this is amongst the largest structures ever built in Britain. And probably closer to an urban centre or a town than anything else. It certainly has streets on the inside of it. On the right is our very own and remarkable in its own way, Castell Henllys, which is 0.6 hectares in size. It's also fiercely defended, but I don't think the people who lived in either one of these would have seen them as the same thing. I'm sure they would have had different definitions. And in fact, defining them by their enclosure isn't that helpful. Nonetheless, as I said beforehand, the need to enclose seems to be a mostly new thing to the Iron Age and later Bronze Age, and worth recognizing as a broad group. In terms of the things that are similar in hill forts, you know, one of the things that I'm almost certain everyone here will know is the roundhouses that are found within them. They're not found exclusively within hill forts, but a lot of them are within it. And actually, we quite often find hill forts are completely rammed full of them. The best example of this, of course, opportunity to see this is in northern Pembrokeshire and Castell Henllys, where the houses have been reconstructed on the spot, which is, to my knowledge, the only place where you can actually see that. I would give one sort of cautionary note, and that's that all reconstructions, due to understandable constraints of budget, give the impression of the rural idyll. But in fact, of course, originally, big banks around that you couldn't have seen, big fences, busy places. These are the central places more than anything. So when it seems quiet and bumbling, I always warn people to not think on that sort of plane too much. Nonetheless, for every time we say, oh, well, it's simply a settlement there's a good example to say, oh, these aren't simply settlements. This is, I think, the best example of that, Dinas Mawr, which is on Strumble Head, again in Pembrokeshire. I'm a Pembrokeshire lad, so that's why you get a lot of examples in Pembrokeshire, which is, to all intents and purposes, an incredibly heavily defended rock off the peninsula. I mean, this is the huge rock that you can see here in Ken's plan. And there is space for maybe a house if you're rounding up, but it really is a defensive a defensive rock. So there's something else going on there. And we do have to think much more beyond than being, plain and simple, oh, well, we needed to defend our settlements. That there's much more going on there than that. Nonetheless, defense, whilst seemingly the most consistent part of it, when you zoom out a little bit, particularly in the later enclosures, you realize that defense is not the full picture. This is Wen, which is an amazing enclosure, and indeed enormous defensive ditches around the entrance at the front, but around the back there's no ditch at all. So probably there is a posturing going on here. You need to have ditches around your hill fort, but a truly defensive purpose we would have to discount, at least in some examples. They certainly have an initial use defensively, I would say, but they definitely evolve beyond that pretty quickly. To give my 2 cents as to what they are, I think they are many things, and I think their uses are diverse, but beyond anything, their unifying factor is that they are typically the central nodes in a much wider landscape occupation. They are the connecting, they are where every road leads to in most Iron Age landscapes, and they are entwined with identity, ownership, status, religion, and community. Seemingly the important thing was always building the hill fort. It's not so much about the defences or the settlement. The community is founded on the basis of the building of the hill fort. When I think of them, I usually think of something like, a medieval town with the church, the market, the castle, all based into one. Perhaps having a defensive function at times, but in real times, and most of the time, they have a much wider and important use than that. So archaeologists love a box, and we've had glimpses of that earlier in my talk. In West Wales, and actually in Britain more generally, we identify 3 predominant types. One thing to note is that Fran Murphy and Ken Murphy, who perhaps had the greatest influence on West Walian understanding of hill forts, along with Harold Myton, who did the excavations at Castell Henllys, proposed these 3 types for West Wales, and it's now actually been adapted by the Atlas of Hill Forts in Britain and Ireland, which is one of the best resources of archaeological resources that there is out there. It's hosted by Oxford Archaeology. Go Google it. You want to go exploring hill forts, it's the place to go. And those 3 predominant types are very loose, and that's a good thing. But it identifies sort of hill forts proper. They don't use the word proper, but it helps me. And these are what we all think of as hill forts, and usually slightly earlier on in the chronology. Promontory forts are something we see a lot of in West Wales, and that's where they cut off a headland or similar on either the coast or inland. And enclosed settlements tend to be much, much smaller. They can be greater in size, but sort of slightly less, large in their proportions. And generally, particularly, I'd say this about West Wales carefully, they are later on in the chronology, and we'll go on to why we may see sort of hill forts and promontory forts becoming less important and enclosed settlement becoming more predominant a little bit later on as well. But just to dwell a little bit more on how diverse they are, this is a really helpful diagram, I find, that just shows the different types, the ringworks or the defences of these different monuments. So the difference between Ngorllewin, Wales's largest hill fort, and some of these tiny later defended enclosure is really, really interesting. So we're just going to whittle through the 3 types now, using some examples from Heneb's past. I've been involved with 2 of these, but not in the 3rd. So be sure to ask questions about all three, but expect good answers on two. I am going to sort of also break what I should be doing from an archaeological point of view, and I'm going to show you the real whoppers and the really cool ones, but not necessarily sort of, you know, the ones that are most typical of their type, sort of thing. So Hillforts proper, I'm just going to go through the three biggest in Southwest Wales. If you want to do a tour of Hillforts across Southwest Wales, this is a very good place to start. This is a view that many of you will have known, and this amazing photo taken by Tony Driver from the Commission. And this is Foel Dragan, which I think might be my favourite Hillfort. It's amongst, I think it's number 3 technically in the 3 biggest, but it's fairly remarkable, mainly because it has this kind of golf ball-y effect, all of which are hut platforms, 270 at least, probably closer to 300, none of which seem to overlap. And there's quite a lot of thinking that these actually are, you know, fairly contemporary, these houses. And as I say, just this would have been a busy, not going to quite say dirty, but I'm not far off saying it. It would have been an impressive place rather than the rural idyll. And again, that central node in a much wider landscape. Foel Dragan, or Tregan, as many of you will know, talks about the 3 enormous cairns in the middle, and they are amongst the largest Bronze Age or cairns that we have in West Wales as well. There's a big debate as to what they are. They might be Bronze Age, in which case they're super interesting, because when they built the Hillfort, they respected them, they left them be, and in fact they built a wall around them to section them off from the Hillfort. So is this ancestor worship? Is it respect? Is it fear? Or is it, again, claiming that identity of past peoples? Another interpretation is, are they in fact the important people of the Iron Age, people who lived in this Hillfort? It's a possibility. Iron Age burial is incredibly difficult to find. In fact, it's practically non-existent. And when we do find it, it's always extremely strange. It's either someone who's been executed in a bog, or it's a prince or a princess. It's rarely sort of Joe Bloggs civilian sort of thing. So are these the queens or kings of the day? Again, I'd be quite happy either way. In terms of our understanding of this Hillfort, it's almost negligible. And that's because the last person to excavate it was Sabine Baring-Gould in the 1890s, who found some really interesting things, including some Roman things or Romano-British items. So it might be that it has a bit of a later life too, but we would struggle to rely on his understanding today, although he did a very nice plan. This is the LiDAR plot of it, just to show that sort of golf ball effect for anyone who's interested. It's also got a very nice annex out here as well. This is the largest of all. This is the largest in Wales, to my knowledge, at 11.2 hectares. And this is where you start to really get a sense of how impressive these structures are. This is by Llangadog in Carmarthenshire. It's actually one of 2 forts. There's a smaller fort down here as well. And it is a really amazing thing. I'm not going to dwell on it too long because we're going to run out of time otherwise. But please, if you are planning that amazing tour, do make sure Ngorllewin is in there as well. In terms of Hillforts, we're going to spend a bit more time talking about Pendinas, my favourite Hillfort in the world. I can see a few people in the chat who are either people who've been involved with the project, and what a project it was. A few years ago, we had an amazing Heritage Lottery funded project hosted by Heneb and the Royal Commission at Pendinas, attempting to connect the local community of Penparci with their amazing monument. And Penparci is on the edge of Aberystwyth. You can see Aberystwyth in the background there. And it is one of the most stonking hill forts that you'll ever see. I must say, I hadn't spent much time in Aberystwyth before this project, but you know, this really sold me, I must admit. We weren't the only people to have had a pop at Pendinas, and it's something it's worth saying is that hill forts were something that was the fascination of people both in the 19th, 18th and 19th century, but also in the early 20th century. And Pendinas was excavated by Darrell Ford. It was excavated quite well by Darrell Ford in the 1930s. See Ford there in the middle, looking smarter than everybody else, with what I suspect is a mostly ceremonial spade, and his hat. His hat will pop up again, just as is a relaxed Ford overlooking a ditch. And this is part of the problem with these earlier excavations, is that they were quite destructive, but also the records were often quite poor. But equally, they weren't standing on 100 years worth of innovation. And this is a really good example of this, because we have no idea where this ditch was, despite the fact it is an enormous defensive ditch somewhere in Pendinas Hillfort, and I would really love to know. This is my favourite photo of all, and we will stop postcard searching shortly. And the reason is Ford's hat is back, you will all notice, but also he is using, this is at the south gate, and you can see the defence is looking incredibly fine there. And he has used two young boys, I think, to act as a scale in the enormous gate posts. These ramparts are being held up and have been undermined by a post hole, by a fence post. I think probably we wouldn't do this today, it would be fair to say, but an amazing picture nonetheless. And again, Pendinas does highlight some of the problems with hill forts, despite being incredibly visible and often actually very well preserved because of their size. They are incredibly difficult monuments to tackle, and that's because of their sheer scale. This is a picture of Pendinas, an incredibly well excavated hill fort compared to most, and you can barely see the years and years of excavation, which are detailed on that map, believe it or not, both Ford's and our excavation trenches. Just to lead in a little bit more and to explore the fort, we've got this. Pendinas is not actually one fort, it is two forts, a southern fort and a northern fort. And we actually found that in geophysical survey there is more defences on the outside as well. Its really distinctive feature is these enormous terraces which have been hewn out of the hillside by hand. Again, hundreds of thousands of man-hours to build these structures. For who, for why? Those are the questions that make hill forts so interesting. Our excavations attempted to follow Ford and try to understand his excavations better before working into new excavation areas. This is the rampart that Ford excavated. Actually, the bit with the boys is just here. And this is the road which went into the fort from the south. We did a variety of things. Again, our interest is the people of the fort rather than the defences. So we spent a lot of time looking at some of the hut platforms, of which Pendinas has quite a number, and trying to date and understand how they sort of fit into the history of the fort. It was amazing. These houses, incredibly complex. I think it's fair to say we did two of these hut platforms. This one and the next one, and this shows you how 3D they were. So the one in the previous photo is up here, which hasn't been excavated yet, and this is me standing there like a wally. There was about 18 foot between me and them. And the other thing that was definitely a consideration in the Iron Age and today was water management, because there was this huge complex drain system running across the site, and they all started working during the excavation, particularly this one, which runs out and then down onto the bottom terrace. We do start to get an idea of what these houses would have looked like. This is a rough reconstruction of what we think the huts would have looked like. So rather than huts on a platform, this is sort of a hut platform. So they're sort of terraced into the side of the slope. They would have been real, if people are wondering why they're all round houses make a lot of sense. They are really good structures that would have held up on top of the hills, and they are on top of hills, Hillforts, and would have stood the test of time, very much so. We also did some work at the northern end of the fort. For anyone wondering, this is the Wellington Monument. It's not Iron Age. It's supposed to be an upturned cannon, which was supposed to have a statue of Wellington on it, but unfortunately they ran out of money, so there isn't. But it is not an Iron Age feature. It's currently under repair. I'm very pleased to hear. And we found more of that amazing revetment. Again, just remembering that beneath the sort of humpy bumpiness that we talked about earlier, there are actually well-built structures that, were really quite robust. Pendinas is a really good example of how little stuff you often get on Hillfort excavations. This is pretty much the total finds of all of our excavations, and Ford didn't find very much either. For those wondering, these at the bottom are spindle whorls. Actually, this one, and this one are spindle whorls. The bottom one and the top one, they're beads. This one is of stone. The one at the top is of amber. And the amber one almost certainly comes from the Baltic, which gives you an impression of how crucial trade was. And Pendinas is built at the confluence of the Rheidol and the Ystwyth and the sea. And again, its placement is a deliberate act rather than just being the nearest hill on which to build. And at the end, of course, we reconstructed it, the houses we were looking at, for those two there, for those wondering, and what a fine fort it is as well. I think the only thing I'd say, bit too green for me. We did keep on sending you back saying, can you make it a bit browner, a bit smellier? I know it's difficult to convey smell, but that's what I want. These are powerful, impressive spaces. You'll also see something that's always quite interesting in reconstructions, and that's the cheating that goes on. We don't know anything about the North Fort, so you always find it's in the background and a bit fuzzy. But anyway. Moving on to promontory forts, you will notice that promontory forts are inland and coastal. These are two really good examples, which we know quite a lot about. On the left, you've got Portherau, an amazing promontory fort on the coast of Solva in southern Pembrokeshire, and we have inland versions as well. How similar they were is fairly debated. I think one thing they do have, which sort of aligns them, is that the promontories are usually aligned with rivers and the sea, and they're often used for quite a long time. Possibly that's because of their greater use in trade as much as anything else. They're often massively defended along the edge that isn't naturally defended. Some of the biggest defences you'll see on Hillforts, full stop, often with quite a small internal area. In terms of that map, which I think someone just asked a question about, look at that. We are here in southern Pembrokeshire for this one, where we have a real density of promontory forts along the coast. In fact, they're pretty regular along the coast. The next one to the left of this one being Carvai, which has also been excavated, not by us. It's on National Trust land, and Cadw funded the most amazing set of excavations on this project, along with other partners. And it's this photo that shows better than anything why we were there doing these excavations. And that's that promontory forts, in particular, the coastal promontory forts, are amongst the most threatened archaeological remains that we have in West Wales. These are the defences, for those wondering. This is what's remained remaining of the fort, and of course there would have once been an enormous internal area. Portherau sits above some really big caves which collapse at various intervals. This would have once been amongst the largest promontory forts in West Wales, we think, and there is almost nothing of it left. So we are there very much to rescue and understand it before it's gone. In terms of what we found, as I just include this photo because there are significant considerations when excavating a promontory fort that close to the sea. You can see all around us there is not much left. And I'd like to thank Toby Driver for flying over whilst we were excavating. The remains were exceptional, as you would expect. I love this photo showing the entrance of a hill fort, which we haven't dwelled on much so far, but they really are the most amazing part of hill forts. They're often incredibly long, drawn out, designed again, both seemingly in a very defensive way to try and control and corral people and possibly animals, but also to give that sense of awe, that sense of power over the people coming into the fort. They become incredibly complex. The one in Portherau is pretty amazing, very narrow actually. So this is a meter scale here. But I love this photo more as all of us who are involved do, because it's 5, 6, 7 people sat on a road that hasn't been seen in 2,000 years and recording it before it goes. A pretty special thing to do. You can actually see here that there is an insertion in this entranceway. So they made it even narrower at some point during its life, late on in its life actually, and put in a new gate here. And that was probably associated with a major Roman or Romano-British reoccupation of this fort. In fact, a lot of what we excavated, certainly in the later seasons, was Romano-British rather than Iron Age. So I've spent the last 40 minutes saying, oh, it's all Iron Age, but actually, particularly in promontory forts, actually, we do see this continuation well into the Romano-British period. And Portherau, we've got remains going back to sort of 4, 5, maybe even 600 BC and continuing through in sort of the hundreds AD, which means that, you know, this fort may have been used for up to sort of 1,000 years. You know, these are really, really long-term important places which are utilized again and again, and actually their use may have significantly changed over time. We think this latest part of its use was actually mostly clustered around the entrance, particularly around this amazing stone-built roundhouse, which looks like it's got a coastal view, but of course, you know, it wouldn't have at the time. And this structure is absolutely incredible. It's one of only a few in Wales that have been found. There's another really good excavation in North Wales at Dinas Dynlle that found a similar structure. And it seems to be a bit of a theme. We have these enormous, almost megalithic roundhouses. Roundhouses are typically pretty humble structures, as in they're not quite functional, but you wouldn't have said, oh, that's a really impressive roundhouse very often in a hill fort. But during the Romano-British period, they seem to really, really get into building some really substantial roundhouses in these promontory forts and hill forts. It's quite unusual as a building as well. It doesn't seem to be a house. Best guess is some kind of ritual, and everyone rolls their eyes when archaeologists say ritual building. It doesn't seem to have any functional use. We did go through a period of thinking it might be associated with metalworking because there's lots of heat being used throughout the centre, but actually the metallurgy experts have said that that's not the case. Just to give you a sense of how large the features of this roundhouse are, this is the doorstop here, which I reckon must have weighed half a ton or so. really, really super and impressive thing. And again, here we are just from another angle. It's a good looking thing, so I've put lots of photos in. And the finds, because it is the Roman period, were a bit more numerous. Not a lot more numerous, but there are certainly more of them. And we see different materials. We see glass, we see stone, and we see pottery. But one of the real curiosities of the Iron Age is, despite the fact people being very accomplished potters during the Bronze Age before the Iron Age in Wales, and Iron Age pottery being very common in other parts of Britain, in Wales it is almost completely aceramic, or they don't use pottery, which is, number one, really annoying because it's a super helpful thing to find, but it's also it's just very unusual, because pottery is such an incredibly useful thing that is utilized everywhere else. So why they stopped using it is a real puzzle. Was it social taboo? Was it different priorities? The one explanation that isn't worth thinking about is they forgot, because generally they're a lot smarter and a lot more connected than we think. The bead, again, is a really fantastic example of the trade very early on in history. You know, that probably comes from the north coast of Africa or something like that. You know, these are really interconnected people. And just to finish off with enclosed settlement, this is the excavation I didn't have anything to do with. These are the settlements that we were actually looking at the beginning, with the scary heads on spikes by the entrance. That is the Danacoid enclosure and the Woodside enclosures. And you can see the point I was trying to make earlier, which is they become much smaller and they become much more frequent. And it's probably a sign of society changing a little bit. The importance of these great hill forts and great promontory forts becoming perhaps slightly less important. Society becoming a little bit less nucleated, a little bit more rural. And in fact, we're seeing people living more in sort of smaller family groups more commonly. So enclosed settlements, these sort of smaller enclosures, are by far and away the majority of the enclosures that we see. 481 is an awful lot, another 81 possibles. And just to give a sense, you know, this is the kind of numbers we're looking at. We're going from 300 odd in Borjagan to 5 or 6. You know, it really is not that many. And this is the excavation plan of Woodside, a really quite compact society. These are what are called 4 and 6 4 posters, which are very strange things we're not going to go into today. And here's a really, you know, Panacoid, Carmarthenshire. There is one house in it, you know, a heavily defended one house, but one house nonetheless. Ooh, why is that not moving on? This smaller size does mean that we see a lot of these enclosures now flat when compared to hill forts. And it does also say talk of how these tend to be found in slightly more rural positions, good farmland, which has been ploughed as a result. So we see them as both crop marks and geophysical survey much, much more commonly. They're really interesting things. They seem to mostly be built in, as I said, the last 200 years or so of the Iron Age and into the early parts of the Romano-British period. It's important to remember that no more than 1% of the people in Britain were ever Roman. It's a bit like, you know, cutting out the aristocracy and saying everyone's changed otherwise. And this is a smaller enclosure just outside of Castell Henllys. So they stop using Castell Henllys, that amazing one promontory fort that we all know and love, and in fact build a smaller one just nearby. We also see the rise of enclosures that we call concentric enclosures, which seem to be quite distinctive of West Wales, and that are these sort of concentric rings, 40 or 60 meters apart, becoming less and less significant over time, sort of as they go outwards rather as they radiate outwards, with the central one seemingly being the main settlement, and then the outer ones being perhaps associated with cattle enclosure, farming or gardening in some way, or perhaps religious uses as well. Is part of a wider theme of types of site, which some people call banjo enclosures. Again, here's another one of those concentric enclosures that we see. And then eventually they become incredibly complex. So this is amongst the most complex that we ever see in West Wales. Quite a sprawling, amorphous enclosure called Bryngaerau Cymru, just near Nevern in northern Pembrokeshire. Just again, to give you a sense, this is a Namibian settlement next to one of the Pembrokeshire ones. Perhaps it gives you a sense of what they might have been like. An honourable mention now, this is back to a hill fort, but I felt I couldn't give a talk on West Walian hill forts without mentioning Castell Nadolig on the main road up into Ceredigion, which has some of the most amazing Iron Age votive objects. These are Iron Age spoons, or divination spoons, which are now in the Ashmolean Museum. So just when you think you might be getting to grips of what the Iron Age is all about, you realise that it was all about spoons or something strange. So again, just it's important to sort of pull yourself away from thinking you know too much of the picture. So what are those weird bumpy bits on the hills? I don't think I actually attempted to answer the question. I think thinking of them as all sorts of things, but in many ways the important and central places in a much wider and complex society. They are undoubtedly different and they undoubtedly change through time, but they are amongst the most remarkable parts of our archaeological record in Wales. And just to finish off, has that changed? No, it hasn't. I'd just like to mention all of the community groups and staff who have contributed to these excavations over the years. They continue to be important places. This is the Pendinas project, with me needing a haircut. This is Portherau on a very rainy, backfilling day. And the finds and the people on these sites are what made it happen. Thank you very much.